wind tore at the remains of the rigging, turning the frozen ropes into heavy stone whips. The ship St. Paul lay motionless amid the endless white desert off the coast of Alaska in 1918. Ice floes formed a tight ring around the wooden hull, slowly pushing it upward. Navigator Yakov stood on the icy deck and stared at the empty, indifferent horizon. At that moment, he did not yet understand that he was alone with eternity. The temperature had dropped so low that every breath burned his lungs with unbearable cold. The surrounding air seemed heavy, dense, and literally crunchy with crystallized ice moisture. Yakov lowered his inflamed gaze to his numb hands, already covered with a thin crust of ice. People still believed that this was temporary, a normal delay on a long journey. Every crack in the ice was seen as a long-awaited sign of hope for imminent liberation. But the days passed, and the ice fields only became denser, rising like impenetrable white walls. Hope slowly gave way to deep anxiety, penetrating their hearts along with the damp wind. They still hoped that rescue would come, but time was already working against them. Panic spread across the deck faster than the cold, gripping the minds of even the most experienced sailors. Some already understood how it would end, looking at the mangled frames of the stranded ship. They looked at each other and saw primitive fear reflected in their inflamed eyes. They were separated not only by the icy desert, but also by the nascent, poisonous mutual suspicion. At that moment, they ceased to be a cohesive team and turned into a bunch of frightened people. The expedition began in a port filled with the cries of seagulls, the sound of axes, and the smell of tarred ropes. The ship St. Paul was preparing for a long voyage across the harsh waters of the northern seas. Captain Michael stood on the bridge, proudly surveying the sturdy wooden hull of his vessel. He believed in the success of the mission, in the charts charted by the best minds of that ambitious time. This confidence was passed on to the crew, instilling in the sailors' hearts hope for glory and rich spoils. The holds were filled to the brim with barrels of salted meat, sacks of biscuits, and warm clothing. Preparations had been underway for months, with every detail checked repeatedly to rule out any fatal accidents. Yakov personally checked the navigational instruments, knowing that dozens of lives depended on their accuracy. They were ready to challenge the elements, confident in the indestructibility of the human mind and will. No one could have foreseen that nature had prepared a trap for them from which there was no escape. The first weeks of the voyage were accompanied by favorable winds and clear, cloudless, transparent northern skies. The sea gently rocked the St. Paul, as if encouraging the audacity of the people who had ventured so far. The crew worked in harmony. The sailors sang songs, pulled on the rigging, and dreamed of a speedy return. They advanced further and further north, leaving behind the familiar, safe, and warm latitudes. This contrast between the hope of that time and the coming catastrophe made their fate even more tragic. However, the weather in these parts changed with frightening and deadly unpredictable speed. A sudden storm hit them, bringing with it blinding snow and a squally, icy wind. Visibility dropped to zero, and the ship was tossed from side to side amid huge waves. They fought for their lives, furrowing the sails with frozen hands and pumping water out of the holds. It was a warning they ignored, blinded by their pride and thirst for new discoveries. When the storm finally subsided, they found themselves in a completely unfamiliar, hostile, and cold place. The surrounding landscape had changed beyond recognition. The open water had disappeared, giving way to a continuous field of ice. The compass was behaving strangely, and the maps did not match what they saw with their own eyes. The captain's confidence faltered for the first time, although he tried not to show it to his subordinates. Yakov realized that they had strayed off course and gone too deep into the icy embrace. At first, it seemed like an annoying delay that could be waited out in the warmth of the cozy ship's cabins. Then it turned into a harsh sentence, subject to no appeal or possible review. Yakov looked at the frozen sea, realizing that their training had been a waste of time. No amount of dry biscuits could save them from what the coming winter had in store for them. They were not prepared for what would happen next in this white graveyard of ships. The crew began to grumble, and the quiet conversations in the cabins became increasingly anxious and aggressive. The sailors remembered their warm homes, realizing that they might never see their loved ones again. The discipline that had been maintained by faith in the captain began to show its first, as yet imperceptible cracks. They were separated not only by the icy desert outside the ship, but also by a growing mutual distrust. At that moment, the expedition ended, and a harsh, merciless struggle for survival began, pushing them to the limits of human endurance. They still acted as a single crew, habitually performing routine sailors' work, but they already thought like doomed people, locked in a wooden coffin among the ice. The question was no longer whether they would be able to continue their interrupted research journey. The question was which of them would live to see the next icy, dim northern dawn. There was no turning back. The story of their slow destruction had already begun its inevitable course. The critical moment came at night, when the temperature dropped to unprecedented, frightening extremes. The hull of the ship groaned so loudly that the sound woke the entire crew sleeping in the holds. The ice began to squeeze the ship with such incredible force that the thick oak planks of the hull cracked. Black, scalding cold water poured into the gap, instantly flooding the lower decks of the hold. Panic broke out instantly, spreading through the ship faster than the water filled its cold interior. Yakov jumped out of his bunk, pulling on his frozen boots and grabbing a heavy axe. The shadows of frightened people darted around, their cries drowned out by the roar of breaking wood and the sound of water. Captain Mikhail tried to organize a fight for survival, directing the sailors to the pumps and the hole in the hull. They worked waist-deep in icy water, their hands numb and their breath catching in the cold. But the elements were stronger, the water rising, destroying precious supplies of food and warm clothing. After several hours of exhausting struggle, it became clear that it was impossible to save the damaged ship. The ship tilted to one side, its bottom hopelessly crushed by the advancing ice floes. The captain made the difficult decision to abandon the holds and move the remaining provisions to the safe, solid ice. This was a turning point, after which there was no return to their former life on the ship. On the ice, they built a makeshift camp out of sails, planks, and salvaged ship's equipment. The wind mercilessly tore at the thin fabric, and snow swept over their pitiful shelters, preventing them from warming up. They sat huddled together, their teeth chattering, watching the ship dying in the darkness. At that moment, they ceased to be a ship's crew and became simply a group of freezing people. Discipline broke down, and the sailors began to openly blame the captain for the terrible tragedy that had occurred. The captain stood aside, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken, reflecting the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He understood that he had lost the trust of his men, and this frightened him more than the bitter cold. Yakov approached him, trying to find words of support, but the right words simply could not be found. A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the howling wind and the creaking of the dying ship. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone understood that the situation was becoming critical. The supplies that had been saved were negligible for such a large number of exhausted and hungry people. Most of the salted meat and flour remained in the flooded hold, buried forever under the icy water. Yakov took stock and realized with horror that there was only enough food to last a month at best. They began to ration food from the very first day on the ice, cutting back on their already meager rations. Everyone understood that supplies were not infinite, and starvation became a real and tangible threat. Humanity slowly dissolved into a primitive instinct for survival at any possible and affordable cost. Some were already mentally calculating who would be the weak link and die first in this icy desert. They looked at each other and saw not comrades, but only competitors in the struggle for survival. It was the moment when everything finally broke down, from the ship to the human psyche. Yakov looked at the empty horizon, realizing that they were trapped with no way out. Help might come, or it might not, but hope for it was fading along with their strength. The most dangerous enemy was not the storm, but the mistrust that had settled in the hearts of the frightened sailors. Everything was being decided here and now, on this cursed ice under an indifferent and cold sky. The most frightening part of their ordeal began not with a sudden blow, but with a slow, exhausting decline. The cold penetrated their bones, sucking out their life energy drop by drop over long, monotonous weeks. The frozen air scratched their throats with every breath, causing a painful, lung-bursting, dry cough. Yakov felt his body betraying him, becoming weak, unresponsive, and incredibly heavy. They stopped noticing the beauty of the icy desert, seeing in it only their ruthless and silent executioner. Hunger turned into a constant, nagging pain in the stomach that did not let up day or night. Rations were cut back more and more until they turned into pitiful crumbs of crackers and rotten ship's salted meat. People began to chew the leather of their belts and shoes, trying to deceive their empty, maddening stomachs. Their faces became gaunt, their cheeks sunken, and their eyes took on the feverish, crazed gleam of starving creatures. Weakness hampered their movements, and every step through the deep snow required incredible physical effort. The fatigue became chronic, weighing on his shoulders like an invisible, heavy, leaden, cold burden. Sleep did not bring the desired relief. It was shallow, intermittent, and full of nightmarish, icy visions. People woke up from their own screams, suffocating from fear and the bone-chilling night frost. Some began to suffer from visual hallucinations, mistaking ice floes for lifeboats or houses. Their minds slowly crumbled under the weight of unbearable physical suffering and constant, oppressive isolation. Fear settled in the camp forever, becoming as tangible as the piercing northern ice wind. They were afraid to fall asleep and not wake up, afraid of freezing to death, afraid of each other and themselves. The isolation drove them mad, the empty horizon weighing on their psyche with its endless, monotonous white silence. Yakov began to talk aloud to himself, just to hear some kind of human voice. He realized that the most dangerous thing about their situation was not the cruel cold, but the encroaching black despair. With each passing day, hope grew thinner, ready to be blown away by the slightest breath of icy wind. No one looked into the distance anymore, waiting for a saving sail. All eyes were fixed only on the ground beneath their feet. They began to economize their words as carefully as they economized the pitiful remains of their spoiled food. The silence between them became heavier than the wind, filled with unspoken reproaches and hidden anger. They continued to talk about rescue out of habit, but believed less and less in their own empty words. Death had become commonplace, no longer evoking any strong emotions in the surviving sailors. When another person died, his body was simply dragged away and covered with pieces of hard snow. No one read prayers, no one cried. They simply had no strength left for grief. Yakov looked at the frozen corpses and thought only about who would get the deceased's clothes. He was not afraid of his own death. He was only afraid of staying here and never being found. It was a slow, methodical destruction of a man by the primitive forces of the indifferent Arctic northern nature. It did not try to kill them quickly. It stretched their suffering over long, endless months. Yakov felt life dripping away from his frozen, weak human body. He still hoped that someone was looking for him, but this hope was more of a habit than a sincere belief. He did not know how many more days he would have to spend in this agonizing, icy agony. The world continued its life somewhere far away, unaware of the suffering of a handful of people in the ice. For them, time had stopped, turning into an endless series of identical, cold and hungry days. This was not the end. It was the beginning of their most real and most terrible life test. Nature made no distinction between captain and sailor, killing them all equally slowly. No one knew if even one of the remaining crew members would survive this icy night. The realization that there was no help coming did not come to them all at once, but gradually. It was like slowly sinking into dark, icy water that took their breath away. Yakov stood at the edge of the ice field and stared into the gray, lifeless emptiness of the frozen horizon. The horizon was completely empty, not a single trace of a person or rescue ship for miles around. At that moment, he finally understood. No one was coming for them. They had been left here to die. Ivan was the first to voice what many were thinking but were afraid to say aloud by the dying fire. He suggested taking the remaining supplies from the sick and wounded, claiming that nothing could help them anymore. This proposal split the camp in two, exposing the darkest and basest sides of the tormented human soul. Panic and malice spread faster than the cold, destroying the last remnants of humanity in the freezing people. Some were already mentally saying goodbye to home, preparing to do what they would never have thought of before. Yakov found himself caught between two fires, trying to preserve what was left of his sanity in this rapidly escalating madness. He understood that Ivan was right from a survival standpoint, but his conscience refused to accept this plan. On that day, the real countdown to an inevitable bloody and brutal internal showdown began. They ceased to be a team, turning into a pack of hunted animals ready to tear each other's throats out. From that moment on, time became their main, ruthless enemy, pushing them to the edge of the abyss. From that day on, the expedition was finally over, and a vile, low, and despicable struggle for survival at the expense of their comrades began. Help might come, or it might not, but now they were killing each other faster than the frost. Yakov stayed with the wounded captain, realizing that their chances of rescue had fallen to absolute zero. He bandaged the commander's broken face, feeling his own hands tremble with impotent rage. They still hoped that the situation would be resolved peacefully, but hope did not change the harsh, merciless reality. The mutineers were camped a few hundred meters away, their fire burning brightly, fed by the remains of the ship's planks. The smell of roasted, salted meat wafted from there, driving the hungry people in the captain's camp mad. Ivan and his group took not only food, but also most of the warm clothes and muskets. They separated themselves from the doomed, deciding that their own lives were worth betrayal and murder. The question was no longer whether all the participants in this cursed northern expedition would survive. They began to blame each other for all their misfortunes, trying to justify their weakness and cowardice. At that moment, everything depended only on themselves, on their ability to remain human until the end. It was a moment after which everything changed forever, and there was no turning back. The loss of hope turned people into monsters, ready to do anything for one more day of painful life. No one wanted to take responsibility for the blood that would inevitably be spilled on the white snow. They still believed that this was temporary, but time had already passed its cruel judgment on them. Nature made no distinction between traitors and loyalists. It froze both equally. Life in the divided camp quickly turned into an exhausting, paranoid war of attrition. The captain's camp was slowly dying of hunger, while Ivan's rebels were conserving their supplies. Yakov watched as his comrades quietly fell asleep in the cold one by one and never woke up again. At first, they tried to ask the rebels for food, but all they heard in response was mocking laughter and threats. The situation worsened with each passing hour, and everyone understood that it could not go on like this for long. Captain Mikhail, weakened by his wound and malnutrition, knew he had to do something. He gathered the few loyal men who were left, the few who could still hold a weapon. They decided to attack Ivan's camp under cover of darkness to take back the stolen provisions by force. It was a desperate decision, a step into the abyss from which there was not the slightest chance of escape alive. They looked at each other and saw fear mixed with the grim determination of doomed men. The captain engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Ivan. It was a battle between two exhausted but fierce opponents. Mikhail struck with his saber but slipped on the ice, and Ivan plunged his knife right under his ribs. The captain collapsed to his knees, his eyes wide with surprise and sudden, paralyzing pain. Yakov was too late to save his commander, but he managed to strike Ivan with the heavy butt of his rifle. The leader of the mutineers fell, coughing up blood, and the fighting around them suddenly died down. The survivors stood among the corpses, breathing heavily and looking at the work of their own frost-bitten hands. The supplies that had started this slaughter were scattered in the snow and trampled into a dirty, bloody mess. Of the 20 men, only 7 remained alive, wounded, exhausted, and broken in spirit. They had not defeated each other. They had only hastened the work of the merciless Arctic winter. It was the moment when discipline cracked and crumbled into fine icy dust. The cold united them during the day as they dug shallow graves in the rock-hard, sparkling snow. They were no longer divided into camps. Death had made them all equal, the mutineers and the captain's loyal sailors. The remaining supplies were gathered together, but there was only enough for a couple of miserable days. Each step became heavier than the last, the pain of their wounds exacerbated by the unbearable burning cold. No one wanted to take responsibility for leading the group of walking dead. From that moment on, he was no longer an explorer. He was just a shell clinging to a fading life. The world continued to live, but for these 7 people, time had stopped forever on the white blood-stained snow. They still hoped that someone was looking for them, but that hope was like the delirium of a dying mind. Nature was in no hurry to finish them off. It was simply waiting for them to give up and close their eyes. The horizon was empty, and Yakov knew this with the absolute crystal-clear clarity of a doomed man. At that moment, he did not yet understand that he would soon be completely alone in this endless desert. The wounds received in battle became inflamed, and gangrene began its deadly path through the bodies of his surviving comrades. They died one after another, quietly and unnoticed, simply stopping breathing during a short sleep. Yakov was the last one who could still move. His body refused to give in to death so easily. It was the first day of his real, most terrible ordeal of absolute, all-consuming loneliness. Everything changed in a second when he realized he could no longer hear the breathing of his last companion. There was no turning back. He was left alone with the cold, which knew how to wait so patiently. No one heard his cry when he tried to call for help into the emptiness of the gray sky. At first it seemed like a death sentence, then the only possible form of existence in this dead world. He was not ready for what would happen next, but he had no choice left. Yakov sat alone among the snow-covered mounds under which lay the bodies of his fallen comrades. The silence around him became so thick that it rang in his ears, causing an almost physical, aching pain. He began to speak aloud in a hoarse, broken voice, just to hear some sound in this emptiness. The most terrible enemy was not the cold or hunger, but this all-encompassing, maddening loneliness. No one had prepared him for what it was like to be the only living person at the edge of the world. He kept going out of inertia, mechanically moving his legs, because stopping now meant instant death. Every day he walked around the remains of the camp, collecting small crumbs of bread stuck in the cracks of broken boxes. His body had turned into a skeleton covered with dry skin. His movements became jerky, like those of a broken doll. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of only one thing: to disappear here forever and never be found. With each passing day, hope grew fainter and fainter, until it finally dissolved into the frosty haze. The world was too far away to hear his cries for help, which dissolved into the howling of the north wind. Help might come, or it might not. This thought fluttered in his head like a wounded, exhausted bird. Once he found a frozen compass in the snow, which had fallen out of the pocket of the slain Captain Mikhail during the fight. The glass was broken, the needle was frozen, pointing nowhere, symbolizing the complete meaninglessness of their original journey. Yakov stared at this useless device for a long time, realizing the futility of human ambitions in the face of the power of nature. He threw the compass into the snow, realizing that no device would ever show him the way home again. His only guide now was his instinct for self-preservation, which dictated only one rule: do not close your eyes. He did not know if he would survive the night, wrapped in the frozen rags he had taken from the dead sailors. The wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves, trying to tear off his pitiful protection of dirty fabric. The physical pain dulled, giving way to a strange numbness that rose from his feet to his chest. He realized that this was a sign of the imminent end, the very moment when the ice would finally defeat the flesh. But even then, he continued to fight, stubbornly refusing to submit to the inevitable course of events in this emptiness. But time was already working against him, accelerating the destruction of his body, deprived of all nourishment and warmth. He could no longer feel his arms or legs, having turned into a living statue of ice and pain. The most frightening thing was not the pain, but the silence that came when the wind briefly died down over the ice floes. From that moment on, he became part of the landscape, another frozen mound among the endless ice of Alaska. The world continued to live, but for Yakov, time stopped forever. He was not ready for what would happen next, but now it no longer mattered. Nature was in no hurry to kill him. It simply waited for its moment and took what was rightfully its. A long journey awaited them, and none of them made it to the end. Decades passed before human feet set foot again on this cursed, lost stretch of icy coastline. A whaling ship accidentally stumbled upon the remains of a wooden hull frozen into the ice floes, disfigured by time and storms. The sailors climbed down onto the ice, examining the grim ruins of the ship that had become a mass grave for its ill-fated crew. They discovered the remains of a camp, scattered belongings and frozen bodies, perfectly preserved in the Arctic cold. It was a gruesome sight, a frozen snapshot of human despair and bloody madness. Among other things, they found the body of Jacob, sitting in a strange position, as if staring at the empty horizon. His face was calm, the expression of agony before death long replaced by a mask of icy peace and eternity. A piece of canvas was clutched in his stiff fingers, on which illegible words had been scratched in charcoal. The whalers did not take the bodies away, deciding that the ice would be the best and most reliable sarcophagus for them. They took only a few artifacts to prove their discovery at the port upon their return home. The world was too far away to save them then, and now it could only acknowledge the fact of their terrible death. Help might have come, or it might not have. But in the end, only death came in the form of white silence. On that day, the countdown to their eternal sleep began under the thick snow that never melted completely. It was not the end, it was the beginning of their existence as silent symbols of the cruelty of northern nature. From that moment on, time became their guardian, protecting their peace from the interference of busy, living people. Nature made no distinction between Captain Mikhail, the mutineer Ethan, and the lonely navigator Yakov in their graves. Everything was decided here and now, 100 years ago, and the result of that decision lay before the whalers' eyes. A long journey home awaited them, but they did not make it, remaining forever tied to their dead ship. They still had hope at the very beginning, but hope does not change reality, carved out of ice and piercing wind. And they became part of that reality, merging with it into a single, indivisible, frozen whole. They looked at each other and saw not people, but competitors for pitiful crumbs of food and warmth. Panic spread faster than the cold, destroying reason and pushing them to acts unthinkable under normal human conditions. No one wanted to take responsibility for the killings, but everyone was willing to kill to survive. The captain still maintained his composure, but his authority was illusory in the face of impending starvation. At that moment, they ceased to be a team and became a pack devouring itself from within. This is a story of a trap from which it is impossible to escape, because the main obstacle lies within the human mind. Yakov was left alone, having outlived everyone else. But this survival became the most terrible and longest torture for him. He realized that the most dangerous thing was not the cold, but the despair that eats away at the soul faster than frost eats away at flesh. The world continued to live, but for them, time stood still, forever fixing their defeat in the icy desert. They did not know that their suffering would become only a short, nameless line in the archives of old whaling journals. Today, the same wind howls in that place as it did many years ago, carrying stinging snow. The horizon is still empty, and the ice floes still mercilessly crush any objects that fall into their embrace. Nothing has changed in this white silence, which holds the secret of the lost crew of the Russian ship. The Arctic did not kill them quickly, like a merciful executioner with an axe blow. It simply waited.